Well, good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. This evening we have a truly international audience and we are pleased to welcome an international speaker too. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Professor Leah Garrett, who joins us from New York City and whom I will introduce in just a moment. You're welcome to ask questions. Please do this by typing whatever it is you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. And as ever, we will try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Please also note the chat facility. This allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, we will be recording this event and it will be available on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the coming days. There you'll find recordings of other past events and details of our future programme, along with the ability to book tickets for those talks. And so to our guest today. Leah Garrett is Professor and Director of Jewish Studies at Hunter College, City University of New York. She has published 5 books on Jewish studies and has won and been shortlisted for numerous literary prizes. Her new book, X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos Who Helped Defeat the Nazis, has been featured on CNN, in Time magazine, and The Guardian, as well as a range of other publications. Leah, we're really delighted to have you with us this evening. A very warm welcome, very warm Milim welcome to you. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really pleased to be here. Thank you.
Now, your book is called X-Troop, The Secret Jewish Commandos Who Helped Defeat the Nazis. There's probably a clue in the title, but I think we should hear from you. What is the X-Troop?
So in 1942, when the war was not going great for the British, Churchill and Lord Mountbatten came up with a plan that they would create something called the Inter-Allied 10 Commando. And the idea with Inter-Allied 10 Commando was that it would be composed of soldiers who were desperate to get back to their home countries and fight the Nazis. So there would be a French troop, there would be a Polish troop, and there would also be something that they called the British troop. Now, the British troop wasn't the British troop. It would actually be a top secret commando unit of German speakers. And the idea was that these commandos would have this incredible advantage to everyone else on the battlefield, because not only would they be trained to kill and capture the enemy, but because of their German language skills and their deep training in counterintelligence, they could also interrogate the enemy on the battlefield in the heat of battle to figure out what to do next. Where are the mines laid? Where's the German machine gun nest? So that they would be these hugely crucial unknown weapons in defeating the Nazis. So that was the idea in 1942. And what they didn't really talk about, or wasn't part of the equation, was that at this point in 1942, something like 85% of the Germans who are in the UK, the German speakers, are Jews. So what ends up happening, and I'm sure we'll go through the whole sort of story of how we get there, but this commando unit of about 87 men ends up being basically 97% Jewish. And the majority of the men who end up being in this commando unit are Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria. Most of them come when they're teenagers to the UK, usually by themselves, when their parents had to make this impossible, mind-boggling choice that the only way they could save their kids was to put them on trains, either with kinder transport, which I'm sure most of the audience knows about, or just by themselves, because as we all know, nobody was taking Jews. There was nowhere for them to go. But fortunately, the UK had set up two really good things. One was a good transit visa program. So for many of them, they came on temporary transit visas and then ended up staying, even though they were just teenagers, or on kinder transport. So they come by themselves from often very cultured middle-class Jewish backgrounds. they get to the UK, and at first it's actually a safe place for them. And then, as I write about in my book, and I'm sure we'll talk about, Churchill infamously declares with the outbreak of war that we need to collar the lot of them, which means the Germans, again, not thinking through that 85% of them are Jewish. And I'm sure we'll talk about that, but basically all the guys who end up being the X troop are single young men, and that's considered the most dangerous category at this time. And that's who gets interned. So they all have a story of internment that I write about. And I even interviewed still living commandos to hear their own story of how that internment was, which was horrific. And then they're chosen for this top secret commando unit. And just two more points about it generally. One is that they were extraordinarily effective in the war. They were on all the most important battles. They interacted with all the major figures of World War II, Lord Lovett, Lord Mountbatten, all of the folks that we've all heard about, but they were this crucial secret weapon because of their commando training and because of their counterintelligence training. But most importantly, because they were Jewish, and the war was personal for them. And they had to get the war to finish so they could find any family members who were still alive. So for them, the clock's ticking and they'll do whatever it takes. The other thing to know about them, which is one of the most extraordinary aspects of many extraordinary aspects of these commandos, which is that the British knew how dangerous their jobs would be for these men. That's why they call them the British troop. They don't want anyone to know that they're Germans and that they're Jews, because if they're captured as Germans, they're going to be killed by the enemy for being enemies fighting against their own country. If it's known they're Jews, they're of course going to be killed, but then any family members who might be left, the Gestapo is going to find. And then they're also going to be killed as commandos because of the commando edict that Hitler has done. So the top secret nature of it means that when the men are chosen to be in the X troop, they're given about 10 minutes in order to come up with a fake British name. So they all come up with fake British Anglo-sounding names like, Andrew Roberts or Fred Gray. They all have to come up with British backstories about why they have these intense German accents. They might say, I had a nanny who was German, or my dad was in the diplomatic corps and I spent my childhood in Austria. And then they all would have Church of England dog tags. So if they were buried at war, they would be buried under crosses. And this is something we were talking about before we started the interview, which just all thrown right now, that this incredible thing happened about a week last Sunday, was when after the book came out, I got an email from someone in California saying my great uncle was in the X troop, and he was buried under a cross. And, we don't know what to do about this. So I put that person in touch with Martin Sugarman, who many of us know about, who's this incredible British Jewish veteran who's devoted his whole life to getting the story of Jews in service out. And so I put this reader in touch with Martin Sugarman, and I figured something was going to happen, but I didn't quite realize what had happened until I got sent a Zoom link last Sunday, and I joined up and I watched, crying my eyes out because I couldn't believe I was seeing this happen so soon after the book came out, while this ex-trooper was moved, his cross was replaced with a Magen David. And it was the most beautiful military ceremony. It was last Sunday with all these Jewish war veterans, with a bugler, a full military sort of display. And finally, he got buried under a Star of David. But that was sort of the other issue about these men, was they couldn't tell anyone that they were German or Austrian. They couldn't tell anyone they were Holocaust survivors at this point, nor for those who are religious that they practiced Judaism, because it was too dangerous. So they had to go deep undercover for the entire war.
Wow. So thank you. So I'm looking forward to digging into the story a bit more and exploring it. As you and I were discussing, I also have a great uncle who Martin Sugarman arranged the change of a tombstone, As far as I know, my uncle was never undercover. He was just buried under a cross because that's what happened. And anyway,
Yeah.
many years later, with Martin's help, we got it changed. So he is a remarkable man.
Yeah.
So tell me, how did you come upon this story? And what was it about this story that made you want to tell it in a book?
So my last book was called Young Lions: How Jewish Authors Reinvented the American War Novel. And it focused on Jewish American soldiers, particularly like really well-known ones like Joseph Heller, Herman Wouk, others who wrote these best-selling novels after their war experience about World War II. And what I argued in that book was that Jewish authors in these best-selling novels, all of them who had been in the military, really taught Americans how to understand World War II. And they also wrote about the importance of being aware of the Holocaust at the same time when you write about World War II. After I wrote that book, I was still deeply obsessed with World War II, but I also felt strongly that a lot of military histories about World War II don't talk enough about the Holocaust. There's some that do talk about the Holocaust. Winds of War was one that talked about the Holocaust as well as World War II, but a lot of the sort of major military historians just focus on the war. And so I was looking to write another book about Jews who fought back during the war, because that was my other feeling, was we don't have enough stories about Jews who fought back. We have a lot of stories about kindly Gentiles who saved Jews, but a lot of Jews were also saving Jews. And I was really interested in that story too. So I discovered that there was this unknown commando unit and had this remarkable realization that no one had written a book about it. There was a chapter here and there about it, or somebody might have written an autobiography, or there might be a biography. But what I discovered when I found the story was that there was a massive wealth of material. There was archival material everywhere at the Imperial War Museum, at Kew, at the American Holocaust Museum in Australia, where some of them were interned. But also when I decided that I was going to write this book and started to get in touch with commando kids, I discovered that all these different families also often had a great deal of material to share. So I got really lucky, because also at the same time, I discovered that there were actually still commandos still alive. So when I started to write the book, I wrote it very quickly, but did a huge amount of archival work, luckily right before the lockdown. And I managed not only to get in touch with all the families, but to get in touch with commandos as well, which was really important to me, that I tell their story from their own voice as well. And then it just evolved very quickly when I knew I was getting to write this remarkable book. And for me, the timing was really important, because I was writing it and it was published in the United States and the UK, all over the world, when there's been a massive upsurge in anti-Semitism. So another reason that, like, I think at this point I've done 30 book talks, is this feeling that it's really crucial to get the story of the X-Troop out for people to buy the book for their kids and grandkids, because it tells such an important story right now that I feel we need to hear about Jews fighting back, that Jews were there, they captured Nazis, they were crucial to the success in World War II. And when the book came out, the Daily Mail actually serialized part of the book. And for me, that was one of the greatest moments, because I thought, this is really great, because I really want the British public, when they think about World War II, not to be able to think that they need to think about the Jewish soldiers who fought in the commando unit, because my feeling is that these commandos were completely crucial to the British success as well. So it was all of these different things going on at the same time during the trajectory of writing and publishing the book.
So did you, I suppose the critical nature of some of the actions these commandos undertook, was that something you discovered during your research? It was something you weren't aware of previously?
Absolutely discovered during the research, because I knew that there was a great deal of material out there. And I knew that the archives had a bunch of material that I could get for the book. But the problem with a lot of them, one of the great parts about a lot of the material was that they were interviews. People had interviewed a bunch of the men and written down their interviews, and they were in the Imperial War Museum, all these different places. But the thing is that there can be an interview with somebody who says something like, I crossed this river, I encountered a bunch of Hitler Jugend, the most fanatical troops. And, I killed 10 of them, and I beat the enemy, and then I kept going, which sounds extraordinary, but the thing is, I needed to document that this actually happened. So part of the process of writing the book was this discovery as I went through Q and I went through all the different war diaries to make sure that they matched how people described the war. And I kept finding out, my God, these guys were as crucial and as heroic as they said that they were in these interviews. In fact, more so was often the case, because one other aspect of X-Troop that I didn't mention was after they do their training, which I think we'll probably talk about in Wales, the British military quickly realizes that these guys are an incredible secret weapon, that they are so focused on beating the Nazis. They're so physically capable. They're so intelligent. They've had a year of hardcore training as commandos and in counterintelligence, that they're going to be a secret thing that the British military uses, but they're so valuable, they realized after the training, that the British cannot let them fight as their own unit, because if a shell hits them and they lose half the unit, what a tremendous loss that will be. And the British Army also realizes that they're too good to fight just as the separate unit. So what the British military decides it will do right at the start of the war when they're involved with it, with the Sicily campaign and then later with D-Day, is put them in groups of 2s to 6 with existing commando units. So all of the men don't fight as the X-Troop, they train as the X-Troop. They're top secretly known as the X-Troop. Their fake names and badges are tied to the X-Troop, but all of them fight with like 41 Commando, 45 Commando, 7 Commando. So the other thing about writing the story and going to the war diaries was that, like, if I was writing about 5 of the men who landed in Walcheren and were really crucial to winning that island, which they were, then I would find the information in the 45 Commando war diary. So it was a huge overview of these war commando diaries to make sure the stories the men talked about in their interviews matched the actual historical reality, which they did. And that was the discovery, was that as amazing as they sounded in their interviews, when I looked at the war diaries, they were even more extraordinary and crucial to all of these battles. Because again, unlike other soldiers, for all of these guys, the war is completely personal. And they have to do whatever it takes, put their hands up constantly for the most dangerous mission, go behind enemy lines to get intelligence, whatever it takes. Because like one of the guys I write about, Ron Gilbert, he knows he has a sister who's hiding in France. And the minute the war's over, he needs to go find his sister. But if it goes on an extra few days, maybe she's going to be discovered in hiding. So he's going to do absolutely everything it takes. And that was the story for all of the men in the X-Troop. And that was sort of this constant discovery when I would go through the war diaries. There's one man I write about a lot in the book called Manfred Gans, who came from an Orthodox Jewish family in Germany. And he was just incredible. I mean, I can tell you his stories about like landing at Sword Beach and capturing Germans, and just everywhere he's at the front, saving his fellow commandos' lives, capturing the most crucial German positions, complete superhero. And when I'm writing the book, he says in an interview, he talks about this moment that, during the day, these guys would fight as regular commandos with their unit. And then at night, they would be sent on intelligence across enemy lines to gather intelligence. So they're working 24/7, doing the most dangerous and crucial stuff in the war. So this is just a little anecdote, but so he talks in one of the interviews about, oh yeah, and one of these nights, it was a couple of days after landing on Sword Beach, my commanding officer sent me behind enemy lines to gather intelligence, and he talks about how he got the intelligence, but then he heard the Germans, so he lay in a ditch the whole night, and he just lay there very quietly, kept listening, getting the information, and finally, when there's a moment of silence in the following morning, he gets up and gets back to safety. And so I looked that up in the war diary, and I just had this joyful moment when I read about it. And it said something, and his name during the war, his real name's Manfred Gans. During the war, he takes on the name Fred Gray. And it said something like, Yes, and last night we sent Fred Gray across enemy lines, and he went miss. This is the War Diary author, and he went missing, and everyone else was like, "Oh, I hope he's not. I hope he's okay." And I said, "Well, it's Fred Gray. Fred Gray can do anything. He'll be back." And the next morning, as the dawn comes, Fred Gray just walks across and says, "Hello, boys." And it was just incredible because the War Diaries kept acknowledging sort of the superhero aspect of these extraordinary Jewish refugees.
Certainly the level of detail in the book is quite remarkable. The sort of, day by day, hour by hour account of what you're describing is very, very vivid. Is all the information you needed now available, or is some of it still classified?
Well, I had to get a lot of material declassified, and luckily, I just got very lucky with the timing. So a lot of it got done before the shutdowns, like Q shut down, all these different places shut down. Fortunately, I got stuff in right before the shutdown, but I didn't get all the material declassified that I wanted. So my feeling is, in terms of what I got declassified, is I got all the information I needed for D-Day and for Walcheren and the Battle of the Bulge, all these other Sicily campaign I have a lot of material on. But the material that I did not get declassified, which I'm still sort of hoping at some point in the future to talk more about, is the missions that they were sent on before landing, before the war. Well, during the war, but across enemy lines, people were parachuting into Yugoslavia. They were parachuting into France. These kinds of mission, the men kept very secret about throughout their lives. I mean, I can tell you, do you want me to tell you about one of those missions that I do know about?
Sure.
So one of the ones I do know about, which I think is probably paradigmatic of a number of others that are still classified, was the one I start the book with. There's this great Hungarian Jewish refugee called George Lane that I write about. The other men called him the Hungarian hunk because he was extremely handsome. He was one of the few Hungarians, and he was the second in command to the commanding officer of X Troop. He was married to Miriam Rothschild of the Rothschild family, who later would become one of the most important naturalists in the UK. But at this point, she's working for Bletchley Park on the Enigma campaign. They're married to each other very secretly because he's an enemy alien at this point. In the days leading to the Normandy landings, George Lane, because when he was in Hungary, he was on the water polo team, the national water polo team. He's very good at water landing. So he's been sent on a little rubber dinghy to land on the Normandy coast because the British have heard that there is a form of mine that they don't know about. And they're worried if it's a new type of mine that the Germans have, the landings will be a catastrophe. So his job is to land and literally bring back a mine to the British so they can make sure what type of mine it is. He lands the first time and he finds out it's actually just a standard teller mine. He goes back, he brings it, and he says it's teller mine. They say you have to go a second time. He goes a second time. He verifies the information. He sent a third time. The third time he's actually captured. He's with another commando who's not part of the X Troop, who's an engineer. They're taken with blindfolds, and they're driven, and he's looking out the side of his blindfold to see where we're being driven. And they're taken to this beautiful chateau, which has like a moat around it. It looks like a castle to him. He's brought inside. He's a very charming man. And he's told, you need to clean yourself up because you're going to be interviewed by somebody very important. And he realizes that these Germans are going to suss out that he has a German accent when he talks English to them, because remember, they're all pretending that they're British. So he puts on a fake Welsh accent because he thinks it will sound so strange to them. And he says he's Welsh, completely works. He's brought into this library, he's cleaned up, and it's Field Marshal Rommel himself who decides to talk to George Lane without Rommel realizing he's actually a Hungarian Jewish refugee. And they have this conversation that I write about in the book, which Rommel wrote about it later in a letter, so I made sure it was verified. It's extraordinary, and he talks about the treatment of the Jews, just amazing stuff that happened over and over to the ex-troopers. After the interview, he's blindfolded again, as well as the other person who lands, who's been captured with him. But he looks out the blindfold and he memorizes exactly what the castle looks like. Eventually, he's brought to a prisoner of war camp He's not killed as a commando because Rommel, they don't realize who he is. And when he gets to the prisoner of war camp, he tells sort of one of the top prisoners, they're all sort of British officers, who he really is. And he says, I need to tell you, I think I was at Rommel's headquarters. And he describes the strange look of this building, this house he was in. One of the guys who's listening says, I recognize that. And he runs to the library in the POW camp because they have a library, comes back with this book and he said, is this where you are? Chateau La Roche-Guyon. And he says, that's where I was. They radio it back to London. And, you know, as we all know, Rommel's car is strafed like a couple of weeks later. So he's out of the war. And then after the war, George Lane's military medal says, but for the actions of George Lane, D-Day would not have gone on as planned. So that's just one of myriad moments throughout the book where these guys did this absolutely crucial intelligence gathering that was required so that the British would end up winning the war. And I mean, don't even get me started with D-Day and all these other places, but they're all over the place doing these things.
So we've spoken about the internment briefly. We might come back to that later if we've got time. But how did these men get chosen to be commandos? What were the British looking for?
So at this point, after they're let out of internment, these guys are told that they can join the military, but only as part of the Pioneer Corps, which the Pioneer Corps, it's very nice, can I just say, to talk to a British audience, because the audience here knows stuff that Americans have no idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the Pioneer Corps. So it's lovely, or when I say Rommel, that you know who I'm talking about. So the Pioneer Corps, as I'm sure the audience knows, is just sort of a hard labor corps. And it's funny, after I wrote the book, every day I get these beautiful letters from veterans of World War II that just melt my heart. The only angry letter I got after the book came out was from the head of the Pioneer Corps saying, how dare you say the Pioneer Corps was mostly for prisoners and those who were degenerates in the British society. But it was. And these guys were only allowed to be part of the Pioneer Corps and they were not given weapons. So the way that they're discovered for the X Troop is that the military realizes that the Pioneer Corps has a bunch of these, they're called A for Alien Corps, which are completely made up of German and Austrian Jewish refugees who are smart and strong and want to fight. So either they see a little notice on the board saying, come sign up for dangerous duty, or their commanding officers put them forth. And then they're all, the ones who are selected, hundreds of them, are sent to MI5 to be interviewed in London. Not only MI5, a whole bunch of different organizations interview them. They're pretty much looking for three things. They're looking for, as they said later, men with a burning desire to fight. So, you know, why do you want to beat the Nazis? And one of the guys said, because, you know, the Germans took my dad and put him in Dachau. That's a pretty good reason. Like, they all had these personal reasons. Two, they're looking for people who are really physically adept. So they're looking for the people in the Pioneer Corps who win the running competitions or whatever it is, that who just stand out physically. And three, most importantly, is high intelligence, men who are just really sharp and really intellectually capable as well. So that's what happens. They go through a series of interviews in London, and the best of the best are selected to be part of the X Troop.
Is there any information about the people who didn't make it?
There is not any information because the war record, they probably were quietly sent back, and then they chose this group of these very, very elite men. So all of them refugees. Sorry, go ahead.
So what was their training like? What did they have to do?
So their training is one of many strange moments, because their commanding officer is a Welsh gentleman, wonderful man called Brian Hilton Jones, very smart. I think he did languages at Cambridge. Very intelligent, very kind, sort of. I mean, kind, but also a very good leader to the men. He's not Jewish. And the thing is that he's from Wales. And so the training itself ends up taking place in Aberdyfi, Wales, which is a very small Welsh town, which was very strange for these men. Again, like they're these intellectual, cultured men from Vienna or Berlin. They're suddenly thrown into this little Welsh village. They live with Welsh locals, And so for the year, and they do a year or so of training, which is an incredibly intensive training, scaling mountains, jumping out of airplanes, running with Tommy guns, blowing up things, taking apart bombs. They're also getting very intensive counterintelligence training as well. Some are sent to Cambridge to do advanced training, all while they're pretending to be British. They have to remember their fake names and each other's names. They're not allowed to have any personal items whatsoever that show their true identity. They cannot admit that they're Jewish. That cannot come up. They know not to ask each other quietly the stories, because that would be too dangerous if they were captured to know anything about each other. And so they live this life. And for many of them, the Welsh year was utterly transformative, because they, as they said, they went from, you know, one of them said, I went from not being able to hold anything more serious than a pair of scissors to being able to take apart like a Tommy gun with a blindfold, and to run up hills and to do long distance running. So what they all said was about the year of training was it not only developed their commando skills and their counterintelligence skills, but then made them really confident. So when they end up landing at Sword Beach or in Sicily, they are the guys who are at the front of the pack who immediately go into leadership positions, because they feel actually very confident after this year of training. And they know what evil looks like, and they know how important this war is too.
Now, there's something in the book that caught my attention. And this is around the time they're in Wales. It says, Manfred Gans was billeted in the same house as Colin Anson. One day, their landlady quietly pulled Manfred aside and confessed that she had become aware that the men were not who they were pretending to be. She said to him, I'm not really British, my father is Jewish. For Manfred, it was a nice reminder of who he really was. Now, given the deep cover these men were under, this is quite remarkable. Did that story come from Gans, or because well, actually, it seems such, you say so little, and yet it seems to be a really big deal.
It's really interesting. So what happens with the Welsh Village is that Brian Hilton Jones, of course, is training them there, and he knows their true story. He also lets the local police know what the real story is. So now we have people in power who know what the real story is. The BBC after the war actually went to Aberdover and did a series of interviews with the Welsh villagers. Manfred Gans' son gave me the interviews. I just felt so lucky that they never did a broadcast about it. I heard from the BBC reporter a couple of weeks ago saying, yeah, we did all these recordings for this Welsh show and it just never happened. And when they interviewed the villagers, it was so interesting, because the villagers on the one hand would say things like, these men were nothing like the common soldiers, they were so gentle, or they were always talking about philosophy, or so they were recognized as being something strange. They also said, the villagers, over and over again, the big joke that the villagers said in many of the interviews was, whenever we would say to these guys, who are you? They would say, we are English. So they're aware that all these guys have these German accents, and the villagers start to suss this out amongst themselves. One of them says in the interview with the BBC, something like, I could tell by looking at them that they'd already been through so much in the camps, and we just wanted to make it okay for them. So it was sort of unspoken that the locals figured it out, but the locals most certainly figured it out, what was actually happening.
Now, you mentioned briefly some of the campaigns that the ex-troopers were involved with. Where else were they in action? And I wondered if there perhaps was an anecdote or two you might like to share.
So they were in action first in Sicily, on the very first boats landing in Sicily. So we have a group there who end up doing the whole Italian campaign, do the Corfu, do all the campaigns over there, become leaders, become very central to the success there. But that's only a little tiny group. The majority of them are sent to land in a range of commando units on Sword Beach, where, as I said, like Manfred Gans, he lands, he immediately captures 20 Germans. He interrogates them on the sand, finds out where the mines are laid, safely brings the rest of 41 Commando through the beaches. So he goes on, helps capture this crucial radar station. So they're really important in the Normandy campaign. The next big campaign where they're absolutely crucial, which I'll speak briefly about this one, is for the island of Walcheren. This is after they've gone through France. Walcheren is this little island that lands in the way to Antwerp. The Allies know that Antwerp is really essential. They need to get another port because all of the Allied troops are getting bogged down at this point, and Antwerp can be a port. Unfortunately, Hitler has realized this as well. So Hitler starts putting in thousands of very efficient German troops on the island of Walcheren. This island has to be taken to get Antwerp. Manfred Gans, that Orthodox Jewish guy I mentioned, along with a handful of other ex-troopers, are sent with different commando units to take Walcheren. And this is sort of, I'll give you a typical story from it. So they land, Manfred, this guy Maurice Latimer, on the very first boat. They land, they scramble up the beach. They said it was like a little D-Day again. They're being shot at. They get into this town where there's this lighthouse that has to be taken because it's packed with Germans. And it's the crucial site where the Germans are firing on all the landing commandos. Manfred looks behind him and realizes that none of the tanks have made it off the beach. They've all been bogged down on the beach. He has his Tommy gun and he says that I'm just going to take the lighthouse by myself. He starts walking towards the lighthouse with his Tommy gun, yelling out in German, saying, "You must surrender," which must have blown the minds of the Germans, thinking, what is this British commander doing, yelling at us in colloquial German? The commanding officer comes out of the lighthouse. Manfred starts this sort of attempt to get him to surrender, holding his Tommy gun with the commanding officer. While he's talking to him, the other ex-trooper, Maurice Latimer, goes behind, goes into the lighthouse and takes the whole lighthouse and brings out all the captured Germans before the commanding officer has even realized what's happened. And I think on the back of the book, I'm going to hold it up here. The book, by the way, another reason to get the book is it's packed with these incredible photos. So if you can see it, this is a picture of the ex-trooper Maurice Latimer with all the captured Germans who are crucial to them ending up capturing Walcheren and getting Antwerp. So that because they get Walcheren, they can get Antwerp, and it's all highly successful, particularly because these two guys, they're the ones who are sent on all the campaigns in Walcheren to capture the top Germans. They're the ones who negotiate the surrender of the Germans. But the reason that photo is so extraordinary, and it's in the book as well, is one of the other commandos said about that photo, and this kind of tells you the whole story of the ex-troop, which is that we all know that iconic photo, that terrible photo of the little Jewish boy with his hands up, with the Nazis pointing their guns. And what one of the commandos said is so great about that photo is it's actually a photo of a Jew in the ex-troop holding his Tommy gun while he's walking the Germans with their hands up that he's just captured. So that's one of many stories. And then they go on to the crossing of the Rhine and Germany, and they keep being at the front of all the fights, including one guy I write about, Ian Harris, who single-handedly captures an entire battalion in Osnabrück, Germany, simply by going off on his own, knowing he needs to get these Germans and having sort of this confrontation with the head of the German battalion, and captures the whole group of them, and have a photo of him in a Jeep riding ahead with all of these Germans marching behind that he's just captured. So whenever they could capture the Germans without a fight, without a shot being fired, that would be ideal, but they would kill as many of them as they needed to as well.
Now, after the war, you write about a process of denazification. Were ex-troop involved with that?
Yeah, so that's one of the, each chapter in the book, I felt like this should be an entire book. So when the war ends, other British soldiers can go home now because they have a home and they have a family and they can get a job and they can go see their girlfriends or whatever it is. When the war ends for the ex-troopers, it's just starting because now they have to find their families. The war is not over for them. And the British doesn't make it any easier for them because the British, though they decide to naturalize other troops like the Polish troop and the French troop, makes the decision that they will not naturalize the ex-troop. They will remain, this is just a shockingly terrible historical moment. They will remain as stateless Germans after the war. So from 1945 to 1947, their commanding officer, Brian Hilton Jones, is fighting desperately to get these guys naturalized. At the same time, the British Army still realizes how profoundly valuable they are, and they send the ex-troopers to do the denazification campaign. So Manfred Gans, the Orthodox Jew who goes to Walcheren, he's sent back to his hometown of Borken to find out who to figure out who the Nazis are. And he already knows who the Nazis are because he had to deal with them as a child, which is extraordinary, the narrative arc of these guys. So he gets to go back to Borken to be the person in charge of denazifying the town. And he does what many of the guys do, and they're all sent back to do denazification, which is like he doesn't give the locals their food tickets until they sit and watch movies of the extermination camps. Like they put this story of what the Germans did. They made sure they did not forget them. So they're sent either to root out Nazis, either sort of quietly or with guns to track them down. They're also sent to go through documents to find all the information for the Nuremberg trials. So they're the guys gathering all the intelligence for the Nuremberg trials, interrogating high-ranking Nazis. And they do this until about 1946, 47. And finally, they get naturalized, these guys. And so then at that point, they're allowed to, they're demobbed, they can leave the military. And at this point, many of them stay in the UK, and then many of them emigrate as well to America or to Canada primarily.
And a lot of them keep these names that they adopted. Why do you think that was the case?
I asked their kids about this, and I think it was for a number of reasons. One reason is that I think these men who were these really incredible commandos also were still worried for their kids, right? And so they kept their British names, as one of their kids said they wanted to be more British than the British. Many of them didn't tell their kids that they were Jewish. They raised their kids Church of England. So one of them, I think, is sort of the residual of the terror that they'd undergone. I did find that for those who emigrated to the United States, they tended to switch back to their birth names and to raise their kids Jewish. So I think something about being in the UK, maybe about being so close to the war, maybe anti-Semitism, whatever it was, for many of them. Also, they became that name when they were becoming men. So they really did become that British command. That's really who they were, as well as being a Holocaust victim. So I think it was all these different reasons, and all of this ends up playing out when the men decide to create a memorial to the ex-troop in Aberdowie in 1990, where the group who decide to create the memorial are led by this guy named Brian Grant, who really wanted to be British. He didn't want anyone to know he was Jewish. And they make the decision that the memorial, which still exists in Aberdowie, won't have the word Jewish on it. There's no mention that they were a Jewish troop. The plaque that they put in Aberdowie on the seawall doesn't say they're Jewish. The pamphlet that the Aberdowie still gives to tourists makes no mention that they're Jewish. Martin Sugarman has been fighting the Aberdowie Council for decades. Last year, they wrote another email that he shared with me, which said, as far as we're considered, the matter's over. We're not adding the word Jewish. So what Martin Sugarman did is he hired a local artist, and he created a beautiful brass Magen David that they've put at the base of the memorial. And so we tell people, when you visit, if this is important to you, bring little stars of David to the memorial so we can really remind the world that these guys they fought as a Jewish troop, and it's absolutely crucial that we remember them that way. So it's a very complicated story, with many of the men as well not wanting to assert, or maybe not wanting to even, I think probably not wanting to remember or have to talk about sort of the roots of being in the Holocaust too.
We have a question from Leon Collins, one of our audience. Did these incredible Jewish men hide the fact that they were circumcised, which would have been a sure giveaway? He goes on to say Jews in Hellenistic times removed the signs of their circumcision. So
these guys, they would not have changed where anyone could see them. So they would have absolutely hidden it. But I did discover in writing the book, and I didn't put this in the book, that there were definite moments where others suspected who they were, but there was a don't ask, don't tell policy. So people sometimes, often probably, fellow commandos figured out what was going on. And because these guys were sent to other commando units, they often wrote about it that like the commanding officer of whatever commando unit they were with at first wouldn't give them any of the good sort of dangerous work because they didn't trust him because he had a strange accent, or they sussed out that maybe these guys were Jewish, but it never became overt. It was sort of a quiet thing that people didn't ask about, because fellow commandos aren't going to ask about this because they're all fighting together to do this. But for the men themselves, like Montfort Gans, who's Orthodox Jewish, in his childhood, he had to completely sublimate his Judaism. And I tell this story about it when I wrote the first draft of the book. When Montfort Gans had to become Fred Gray, and he had to send his Tolson to fill into the secret address and not let anyone know he's Jewish, I felt that was probably a very profound and terrible moment for him, because I'm Jewish, and I thought, my God, what was that like? When his kids read the book, and he raised his kids Jewish, he's very actively Jewish, his son said to me, that's not what it was like for him. All he knew was he had to fight the Nazis, and whatever it take, he would do whatever it took. So there was a sense for them, including the most Orthodox of them, including Montfort Gans, if it meant hiding it was Jewish or whatever it would take, they would do whatever it took. And other commandos didn't ask about it if they figured it out. But occasionally they would say that they felt that they were treated differently. And the suggestion is because somebody had figured out that they were probably German Jews. But there's a lot of Jews fighting in the British Army at this point. But these guys, as I've been telling you, are pretending to be Church of England. But that's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that question before.
Let's talk about Manfred Gans for a moment, because I don't know if you met him or you met members of his family. Did you actually meet him?
No, I was only able to interview two commandos, Paul Streeton and another person I call Victor Davies in the book. He had passed away, unfortunately. But I know his kids, and I think I became close to them when I wrote the book.
I mean, I'm interested in whether the experience changed him for good. In other words, did he reclaim that level of religious observance that he had in his younger years, or did he find a different level later in life?
Unusually, first of all, he was unusual because most German and Austrian refugees at this point are fairly secular. So he's unusual because he's an Orthodox Jew to start with in the commando unit. Most of them come from fairly secular families. So that's unusual. After the war, and I tell this story in the book, which I really hope people will read, of this extraordinary rescue he does to find his parents in a concentration camp. Absolutely, this extraordinary thing he does. And he's successful. So he has this incredible victory. And he said after he finds his parents, he won the personal war. When he's looking for his parents, though, he's writing letters, he's keeping a diary. So I have all this material. And he says, I am going back to the name Montfort Gans when the war is over. And his daughter, a few days ago, I asked her about the switchback. And she said, she thinks he went back to the name Montfort Gans because it had such a Jewish resonance rather than Fred Gray. So for him, he completely reclaimed his Judaism, and he raised his children as practicing Jews. And he became like the president of a synagogue. So for him, it was utterly essential. For the others of the group who emigrated to the United States, they also often went back to their Jewishness and raised their kids publicly as Jews. But for the majority who stayed in the UK, they did not do that.
That's very interesting, because probably British society British Jewish society in general is a little bit more observant now than American Jewish society.
Yeah. No, I'm not sure what it was, but there was something about being in the UK. Maybe it's because they were just so close to these memories or whatever it was, but they generally were pretty quiet about their Jewish roots.
So Malcolm Sender asks, he says, I read that they rested after campaigns in Bradford. Malcolm says he worked in Bradford. Where was the hostel? Do you know?
I don't know where exactly the hostel was, but there was a newspaper article about this recently. So if you Google like ex-troop Bradford, you'll be able to find out where exactly it was.
We are quite close to Bradford.
Oh, right.
Speaking to you, it's sort of the next the next
Oh,
town.
right. I didn't realize that.
Okay, David Elter says, did any of the ex-troop go to fight in Israel in the War of Independence?
That is a great question. And it's so interesting because we have sort of this idea about the Sabra, the tough Jewish warrior, is born in Israel. What I argue in this book is he's actually born in the ex-troop and in World War II with all of these Jewish fighters in World War II. These guys were totally these tough warriors. After the war ends, I could find absolutely no connection between any of the men and the War of Independence in Israel. And I think it's because the majority of them, when they're let out of the military in 1946 and 1947, decide that they're now going to go on and have the lives that were interrupted that they wanted. So like one guy wants to be an artist. He gets a Fulbright to go to Yale to study art. Montfort Gans really wants to be a chemist. He gets into MIT to do chemical engineering. So after the war, a couple of them stay in the British military. The majority, though, just go on to live sort of peaceful lives pursuing what they had wanted to pursue before the rise of Nazism. So no connection that I could find between what they did and what happens in Israel. Although I think, you know, with all the stuff we're all dealing right now with anti-Semitism and anti-Israel stuff, I think the ex-troopers are yet another example, as we have in Israel, of the importance, in my own opinion, but feel free to differ, of Jews fighting back and fighting back with great strength.
So we have a question from Anne and Michael Crook. Fascinating story, thank you. How many of the troops survived the war, and were the families told anything about those who were lost?
So about 42 of them survived completely intact after the war. It's an interesting question because it was sort of the other way around. The ones who were in the ex-troop were the ones who were actually having to find out what happened to their families in Austria and in Germany and in the Holocaust. So the majority of the men who are in the ex-troop do lose most of their family members and find that out after the war. And part of the reason the denazification efforts become so important to them is because they are on the ground now trying to prosecute Nazis who destroyed their own families. So the information gets out, but only slowly over the decades have the crosses been turned to Magen David's, like a week ago, but more often than not, they're still buried under crosses.
So there's perhaps some long-term work to do there.
Yes.
Yvonne Cheney.
And to change the memorial in Aberdovi.
Yvonne Cheney, one of our viewers, asks whether this might be made into a film. Has there been any interest?
There has been interest, and thank you for asking. But everything's sort of up in the air, and it's kind of complicated because Hollywood seems to be fairly comfortable with like the Schindler's List type movie of the kindly Gentile who saves the Jews. I'm not sure they're as comfortable with the idea of Jews who fight back and save Jews. So I'm hoping that a movie's made primarily to kind of rewrite that narrative a little bit and to say that we weren't always waiting for others to rescue us. We often did it ourselves as well.
Now, are there some lessons you think we can learn from these ex-troopers, things that are relevant to us now?
I do think that I keep changing my mind what that lesson is. Though when the book came out, CNN asked me to write an article for them about the lessons of the ex-troop. This was about 6 months ago, and this was when America was dealing with sort of a lot of the trauma at the southern border and refugees. And so what I wrote about in that piece was about how important refugees were and how important these Jewish refugees were to Britain and how important they were to changing the war and how much we needed to remember that. But I've also, over the last few months, been sort of forced to fight for Jews who have been under attack at my university and other places because of anti-Israel stuff. So now my motive for the book and getting the book out is also about how important it is right now that we are strongly talking about don't mess with Jewish people, because I'm sorry to sound so radical, but it's been a rough few months, but we will fight back, and we do fight back very effectively. So that's my new sort of story that I get out of the book, as I've been dealing with all this stuff recently. Hope that's not too radical for our audience, but that's the truth of how I see it right now.
No, not at all. I mean, there are powerful forces acting against us, and I think
Yes.
we need to rise up and deal with it. Richard Stroud is interested in whether any of these troops were awarded gallantry medals.
Great question. So it's so interesting. Throughout their service, these men were constantly chosen to be sent to OCTU, which is Officer Training School. In nearly every instance, they said no, because they did not want to leave the battlefield. So what that ended up meaning for these guys was they got a disproportionately high number of actual battlefield commissions, like Manfred Gans got one, because that way they wouldn't have to leave and they could stay on the battlefield. So in the one sense, they did get a lot. They didn't get any Victoria Crosses. They got a bunch of military medals and other things. But on the one hand, they got a disproportionate number. But on the other hand, there was a sense that the men talked about in 45 and 46, that a number of the men who should have gotten Victoria Crosses did not get them. And not sure what the story is or why that was, but I think among the men, the sense was that they were, again, it was sussed out that they were different, maybe Jewish or whatever it was. So there was a sort of mixture of feelings about it. One was that they got more than most, but they definitely should have gotten more than they did.
So what is next for you? Do you have another project in the pipeline?
I do have another project in the pipeline, actually, because I have really enjoyed writing about Jews fighting back and just feel this is such an important story right now. So the next book I'm working on is about in the 1930s and 40s, Jewish gangsters, both in the UK, which you guys all know about, with the rise of the black shirts and fascism, and Ridley Road in the 60s, and the battle for Cable Street in the 30s. So about Jewish Jack Spot and Jewish gangsters who fought fascism on the streets of London. Also, at the same time, I'm going to write in even more detail about a number of Jewish gangsters in America, like Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, who were actively fighting the rise of fascism. And my thesis is that it was these Jews who fought back on the streets of London and New York and Newark and LA that really squashed the rise of sort of this comfortable fascist party in both places. So that's what I'm working on now.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that, and
Thank
hopefully you'll come back and tell us all about it when it's published. That will be wonderful. So Leah, thank you so much for being our guest today and for discussing your book with us. It's been absolutely fascinating. This book, X-Troop, is a real page turner. It's got some incredible highs and one or two lows, but it's highly recommended. If you want to buy a copy, please use the link on the Millim website. That will earn Millim a few pennies, but the book won't cost you any more. And to say thank you to you, Leah, I'm going to send you some of my photographs of Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service in action in Israel. Hopefully you'll enjoy that. We'll get your address afterwards to send it to. Now, let me just share a little bit of our future program with our audience. Next Monday, the 15th, we welcome Caroline Shenton. Caroline is speaking about evacuating national treasures from London to Jewish country houses during the Second World War. And note that this talk will not be recorded for copyright reasons. So if you want to see it, you have to see it next Monday night, or it's gone forever. The following week, on the 22nd of November, we have autograph collector Adam Andrusier. He's with us to discuss his very entertaining book, Two Hitlers and a Marilyn, and how he was the inspiration behind Zadie Smith's The Autograph Man. And then on the 29th of November, the acclaimed author Michael Pye will be discussing his new book, Antwerp, The Glory Years. We've just heard how strategically important Antwerp was in the Second World War. This book goes back far further into history, but he's a real gift for us to have as our speaker. And finally, for now, on the 6th of November, we join forces with the Jewish Historical Society of England and welcome Simon Goulden. He is telling us all about Jewish lives in Georgian England. A packed programme. All our events are free, but you can, if you wish, make a small donation, which will help with the cost of our work. There's a link coming up in the chat. These webinars do incur some costs, and if you want to help us, that would be very welcome. We have speakers booked well into next year, so please do visit our website at milim.org.uk, sign up for our newsletter, and that way you'll be sure you don't miss anything. It remains for me to thank our speaker, Leah Garrett, once again. Thank you so much, Leah, for being our guest today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Milim, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
And looking forward to seeing